I thought I heard everything about art, but apparently I didn't. Something new comes up all the time. I bumped into Martha Chatelain, and she was a very exciting lady, and what she does is paper sculpturing. And I heard of paper and I heard of sculpturing. I never heard about both things. Welcome, Martha. What is paper sculpturing all about?
Paper sculpture is using the paper as the medium for creating the works of art rather than as a receiving surface for other media.
How did you get involved in this exciting field?
Well, I've always been an artist, and I've always been interested in paper, and as most artists are, and I wanted to learn to make sheets of paper myself so I could control the surface on which I did printmaking or painting or some other kind of media. What happened was, in the learning process, I got more fascinated with the substance of the paper rather than the surface.
When you're talking about substance, what do you mean?
Well, what I mean is the actual pulp from which sheets of paper are made, which is 100% cotton fiber, and the pulp itself is a substance that had fascination for me. I had a background in ceramics, so I think the fact that the paper could be made into a three-dimensional form similar to a ceramic form.
Is paper made purely of natural fibers?
The paper that I use is because I'm interested in having it last a long time and be archival. And so I use pure cotton and pure abaca fibers. Abaca is banana leaf fiber, and I make my own paper.
Do you grow your own banana tree?
No, they grow it all in the Philippines. In fact, I get it in a form that is ready to be hydropulped and made into pulp. And I mix the cotton with just a little bit of abaca because I like the off-white color that the abaca gives. And then I make the sheets of paper, which are then later sculpted into three-dimensional paper wall sculptures.
When did it all start working, actually making sculptures out of paper? Is it an ancient thing, or is it relatively new?
It's relatively new. Making sheets of paper is very ancient. Started way back in China, and then moved to Korea and then Japan. And in Europe, they were making sheets of paper around 1500. But in the United States, about 10 years ago, artists began wanting, like myself, to make sheets of paper, and then they also got fascinated with the substance. So there are a number of us now working in the medium of handmade paper.
That's very interesting. Is there a school nowadays where people can go and learn about it, or do you have to start it kind of by yourself?
Some of the universities offer courses in paper making now. The most learning takes place in the studio for me when I'm innovating as I go along. Most of my breakthroughs have come in the form of discoveries I've made while something was happening that was an unexpected maybe mistake, which I then later capitalized on and turned into an advantage and learned how to do something new.
I've always been told you can learn best from your mistakes. I never knew that about art. It's the same way.
It seems to be the case, and every time I have something happen that pleases me, then I try to recreate, now how did that happen, and can I control this to the extent that I'd like to in order to create something different.
How do you decide about what color or what shape? Does it come from is it from sculpture to sculpture, or from painting to painting? Is it a sculpture or a painting, or both?
It's a little bit of both, and actually rather than using paint to paint, I'm using buckets of dyed colored pulp, almost like I would use paint. And the decision sometimes is one that is made ahead of time in the form of sketches or a plan that I have to fill a certain space. When I had my first one-person show in 1983, I remember going into the gallery and sitting in a chair in front of this big, huge wall that was going to be the major focal point wall of the show, and just meditating sort of in front of that wall and sort of sometimes closing my eyes and envisioning what would I like to see on that wall. And then the trick is to go back and translate that vision into something tangible in the form of a three-dimensional work of art.
Do you do a lot of things as your mind goes free, you create, or do clients come in and say, I have 1 foot over my couch and I like blue and green?
Well, I mostly create as I'm working on the vacuum table or in the vat, with the pulp and with the substance. Some of the ideas are bubbling up from the subconscious. I think part of the reason I like to do all of the work myself from beginning to end in terms of making the pulp and making the sheets of paper, it may seem tedious to other people. But part of the reason I like to do that whole process myself is because there's something that happens in that routine, repetitious activity that somehow allows the subconscious to bubble up. And
you talk a lot about subconscious. Do you go into a trance before you do your work?
I wouldn't call it a trance, but I really sort of lose myself in what I'm doing, and I'm not in the part of my mind that is thinking, now what shall I do, and planning. But it's more freeing up of the creative urges that happens in the process of doing the paper making.
Did you, as you grew up as a child, were you aware already about the subconscious, or was there something in growing up that your family, did your mother and father or brothers and sisters talked about, or is that something that came later on?
I think I was first aware of the real importance of the subconscious during one particular class I had in painting at UCLA when I was a student there, undergraduate student. And I did this wonderful painting, and the teacher looked at it and he was just blown away, and I got an A+ on it and everything. And he said, well, where did that come from? Where did you get this idea for putting that terrific spot of blue right there? It's just right. And I said, I have no idea, because what happened was he had us sketching the same thing over and over again for weeks, and finally we were allowed to paint it. And the day we painted it, I was so familiar with it, and I'd gone through all of the cognitive part of responding to that particular still life, that when I finally did the painting, I must have been in a trance or something, because when it was done, and I have no memory of doing it.
How long did the whole process take?
It took a couple of hours, but I was so into it, and I think that's what I try to achieve in my studio when I'm doing the artwork, is to have enough quiet and solitude and go through the routine task of making just plain old sheets of paper, and then when I finally get to the point where I'm about to create the large piece, it isn't something I think about, it's something that just happens as it's being done. And like when I was at UCLA, the same sort of feeling that the whole process is happening without my having too much control over it is what I strive to achieve in the studio. So I get out there with all these buckets of pulp in different colors all mixed together, and I actually use the buckets of colored pulp like they were paint, and I pour them together on the vacuum table, and that's when the creative thing starts to happen, and I don't always know what it's going to turn out like.
So the creative, you never know actually when the creative part starts.
You don't, and you just have to be open to it. And some days you can have a really down or flat day, and in that case with my medium, it's very easy to just throw all this material back into the hydropulper, make new buckets of pulp, and start over again, so there's nothing wasted.
Now some artists relate to me that sometimes they have dry periods, like a writer would say they have writer's block. Is there a similar experience in paper sculpturing?
Absolutely. And those are the days that I spend making just routine sheets of paper. But like any writer who sits down in front of his or her typewriter and puts the paper in and starts to write, you have to, or I have to, have the discipline of coming down to my studio every single day and putting myself in touch with the materials and doing something. And usually that's enough to break through so that the creative process can take place and the other ideas or emotions or feelings can bubble up to the surface.
I heard a lot about art therapy, where people say that when they have anxiety or when they're sad, or even when it's a good emotion like happiness, they come and do their work, and it balances them and puts them back together. How is that for you?
Well, it's absolutely true. Now that I've finally reached the point in my life where I can do this full time, I feel deprived when I don't have the opportunity to do it, and it's almost become a necessity. I mean, it has become a necessity, not almost. It is a necessity. I have finally come to the point in my life where this is what I should be doing, want to be doing, and am doing. I've had incredible physiological feedback from this. I've had a complete change in my energy level over the last few years. I mean, it started about 4 years ago when I really started doing this full time. I've got lots more energy. My whole body temperature is elevated. I was always the person that had to have lots of covers and mittens and blankets and coats and everything, and I'm warm all the time. I think there's just so much going on that
Is it like an inner excitement that brings up the temperature?
it must be. And it's the wonderful gliding feeling of being high without drinking lots of cups of coffee or being high on caffeine or any other artificial substance. That must be the endorphins that are being released or something. But it is such an incredible feeling. And sometimes I'm extremely exhausted in terms of the physical work that I've done during the day. But I am so high that I have to be really careful when I'm driving home on the freeway to drive carefully, pay attention, because I'm just euphoric.
Do you start actually sketching little sketches to yourself, or does the creativity actually start when you start making the paper?
It varies. It depends on the project I'm working on. If I'm getting ready for an exhibition or a show, I try to have a feeling as to what I want to convey in that exhibition, because you want a feeling of unity and cohesiveness. So I might do a few sketches, but the sketches are more limiting than they are enabling for me. The sketches are real loose and real suggestive, but they're not actually depictive of what the final work will look like. They just give me a gesture or a feeling of a direction or a shape I want to go in. And then I allow the paper itself to dictate to me what the final thing will be, because you don't really know how that paper is going to fall or how it's going to drape. You don't have a whole lot of control over it. So it's actually better to trust the process and see what happens.
What about lasting?
The lasting quality of the paper is archival, because just like they tell you when you have a fine work of art, it should be on rag paper. This is 100% cotton, or the equivalent of rag paper. And so it's acid-free, and the dyes are the finest fiber-reactive dyes, and they're color and light fast. So I strive to use all archival materials in my work so that it will be museum quality.
That's wonderful. Now, what about lighting? Is there a possibility that the lighting can bleach out some of the colors in the paper?
Well, I've only been doing this for 5 years, Dani, and I have had some very bright, vivid pieces in my front window, and they haven't faded. And I can't say what will happen over a longer period of time. In Japan, they have a completely different philosophy about fading and aging. They use vegetable and natural dyes because to them, the signs of age are signs of stability and, reverence and things.
That's wonderful. I'd like to see now why don't you put your magic apron on, and let's see what happens now. We'll kind of show part of the process, I guess. What are we actually going to show now that you're doing, Martha?
I'm just going to show you how the sheets of paper are made, because I think it's interesting to see how the substance is transformed into an actual sheet of paper. And this is a vat, and I'm going to pour some pulp in here. And this is some orange-colored pulp, and it's going to be poured right into this vat. Watch out you don't get splashed.
I don't do splashing. This looks weird. Okay, it's kind of a peach color.
Yes, there's not quite enough pulp, so I'm going to add a little bit more of the off-white cotton and abaca pulp.
So you actually do your own mixture.
Right. And this will give us enough pulp so that we can actually form some sheets of paper. And the tools that I'm going to use are Western paper-making tools. They actually were developed in Europe, and they're an adaptation from the Oriental bamboo screen. This happens to be mold, spelled M-O-U-L-D, and decal. And the mold is made of hardwood, has hydrofoil-shaped ribs on the back to help with the suction, and there's brass wire and hardware cloth and screen, and some copper to hold it down.
It almost looks like an antique.
Well, it actually probably looks that way because it's had so much use. I made this myself because, of course, you can't buy paper-making equipment. This is a decal, and the decal is used to form a well of water so that when I make a sheet of paper, you'll see how I do it. Just a second. I dip in like this and lift up and shake. And it's the shaking back and forth that causes the fibers to interlock microscopically and make a strong sheet of paper. Then you lift the decal off, and because you've shaken it back and forth, it's allowed the fibers to interlock microscopically.
This is fascinating.
And make a strong sheet of paper. Okay, now I let it drain, and then I cooch it onto this piece of fabric called a felt, and that transfers it from the surface of the mold onto the sheet of felt, and that's a sheet of paper. Now it looks very thick and very wet. Of course, it's mostly water now, But after I make a number of these sheets, then I will press the water out in the paper press. And those are the basic sheets of paper from which the paper sculpture is made.
How fascinating.
Now this is a piece of fabric that I just put over the top to make a spacer and also sort of a blotter between the two sheets of paper. And you constantly have to keep this stirred up.
What happens if you don't stir it?
Well, all that pulp sinks to the bottom, and then you can't scoop it out like this. So lifting it, shaking it, and the fibers have been roughened up in the hydropulper so that all the little fibrils are ready to grab onto one another, sort of like Velcro, how one half of the Velcro grabs onto the other. And then I cooch it onto this felt like this.
Then one of these oh, see, I'm going to be your assistant.
Right.
The next thing you know, it's going to be the Dani Starr paper sculptures,
So
like this.
what I would do is make a whole stack of these called a post of paper, and then lift them off and put them under the paper press and press the water out. I can show you what the finished sheets look like if you'd like to see.
I'd like to do that. Let's have a look at how the finished product of the paper sheets looks like.
Okay, just a minute.
Good.
So here are the final sheets of paper, and you can see that these are already...
It's the same color as what we did.
That's right, and this is the sheet of paper after the water's been pressed out of it, and it's been dried on the drying rack overnight, and it's dry. And you see it's a very strong sheet of paper, and that's 100% cotton and abaca. Now the decal edge makes that wonderful little ruffly edge here, and that's where some of the fiber has crept underneath the decal, between the decal and the mold. And these are the sheets of paper that I would use in my artwork. These form the thin little sheets you see on edge in some of the pieces. The larger, more sculptural forms are made on the vacuum table, which is another process that's quite a recent development in the field of paper sculpture.
Have you designed it?
No, I haven't designed it, but every person who has a vacuum table continues to make improvements on the previous one. It was actually, the concept was conceived in Berkeley by Harold Paris, a professor of art there, about 10 years ago.
Now, talking about accepting art, I know like photography, when it began, it was considered photography, but it was not considered art. How about paper sculpturing? Was that first considered not an art and then adapted?
For a while, people sort of looked on it like an artsy, craftsy thing, and it wasn't really considered, you know, quote-unquote fine art. But it was very helpful for the fact that David Hockney, Robert Rauschenberg, Kenneth Nolan, in fact, Louise Nevelson has done a series of cast paper pieces. So as artists interested in paper who were working in other media tried their hand at working in the medium of paper, it elevated it to a status of being one of the mediums used in fine art. There has been a breakdown in the hierarchy of media in the last few years, thank goodness, because ceramics are now considered, you know, fine art sculpture. Where back in maybe 20, 30 years ago, it was considered a craft also.
Now I see, as I came into the studio, I saw another big working table, and it looks like you're doing different things on that. Why don't we go to the other table and see what you're going to create there?
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, so here we are at the vacuum table, and I'm going to pour some pulp into this wooden frame, and this is going to be a larger, more sculptural piece, very different from the kind of thing I was doing on the individual sheet making over there at the vat. So once I get this poured in here, then I have to do the same kinds of agitating, the same thing that was being done in the vat when I used the mold and decal, and I shook them in order to interlock the fibers. I'm doing here by patting this pulp in order to make the fibers grab onto each other and interlock. So I'm starting out with the almost pure white. It's actually abaca and cotton paper pulp. And I'd like to add a little color to this piece, so I'm going to use some of the deeper peach and pour that right along the side here, on either side, to kind of make a halo effect around that white area. And this is how some of the blending takes place, because the dye from the darker color actually blends in with the white and give you an intermediate shade there.
Looks good enough to eat.
Right. Then I'll add a little bit of a darker color, again on each side. And each time I add a new bit of pulp, I pat it in order to make the fibers interlock. And this wooden frame here is just to hold the pulp in one place so it doesn't fall all over the table. The wooden frame serves the same purpose that the decal did on top of the mold. Give you a well so that this watery pulp has enough water in it long enough to interlock the fibers. That's what I'm doing when I'm doing the padding. It's not unlike cooking in some ways.
I know all about that.
Yes, you sure do. Now this is where remember I mentioned that I don't necessarily know what's going to happen, so I don't necessarily have a plan. Now I have a rectangle, but I'm going to take this wooden frame off, and then I have the possibility of actually moving the sides and making it into some other shape, or giving it some other form other than the rectangle. And then of course once the vacuum pump is turned on and the water is sucked out and it's dry enough, I can actually lift it over onto the drying rack, or just right here fold it and make it undulate, and that's how I get the different three-dimensional shapes. Now I like what this dark color did, but I don't have enough of it, so I'm going to add a little more dark color on top here. You're going to see how that dye blends in. This is what I meant by painting with the paper pulp. It almost is like painting, mixing on top of and over. Now I like the ruffly edges that you get, so I just pat the edges and thin them out a little bit so that I'll end up with very thin handmade paper, roughly sort of edges. Now in order to get some texture on the surface, I'm going to add some other things on top of the pulp that will then later be sucked down into the pulp. First of all, I'm going to use just a piece of cut out foam core for a center, and some pieces here that kind of go off in one or the other directions. Now this is a piece of bubble pack, and that's going to give an interesting texture. Another piece of larger bubble pack, and this is some grid stuff. It's actually the carpet backing. I'm going to lay this on top of the pulp just lightly. I'm not pressing it in, but when I turn the vacuum pump on, the suction will press it in. So now I'm going to clear off the table and cover this whole thing with a plastic drop cloth. And you'll see what happens. Let's move that frame. Thanks, Dani. You make a good assistant. Cover the whole thing up like this. And then when I get this all covered up, I'll turn on the vacuum pump and we'll suck the water out from below. And all the water will be collected in that glass bottle over there. Very hard to come by those bottles, by the way. They are all in plastic now, but the force of the vacuum pump is so intense that it actually would collapse plastic bottles. That's why I have to use glass. It's real important to keep all this sealed down so that the air doesn't get in tight, because if you do, the vacuum is broken and the vacuum process won't work. In getting the plastic down, you have to use a water seal that helps it stay flat. And the water bottles are very hard to come by, as I said. In fact, my mother had to put the alert out to the waterman, and finally he traded her a piece of apple pie for a water bottle because he was delivering it all in plastic bottles now. Okay, now I'm going to turn the vacuum pump on, and it's going to make a lot of noise, but you're going to see how the water is sucked out into that glass bottle. Now the surface is really hard compared to that puffy pulp that we had a little while ago. So most of the water has been drawn out, at least all that we can get with the vacuum pump. So now we're going to take off the plastic drop cloth and break the vacuum and see what we have. Now you help me take off the pieces off the top.
Looks like fun.
It is fun. Oh, this is the best part. So you see we've got these impressions from the bubble pack and the pieces of cardboard, and this is the point at which the piece then can be sculpted. So the three-dimensional, this is always a flat sheet when it ends up off the vacuum table. The sculpture part comes by manipulating it, and there's a limit to what you can do. In fact, there's many times that I've actually ripped it at this point and had to throw it back in the hydropulper and start all over again. But with practice, I mean, this is where the experience is helpful. You can figure out just about how much you can sculpt it and drape it without it breaking. And then after this is done, it has to be allowed to dry on the drying rack.
This is where your sculpture comes in.
Exactly. And then after it's dry is when I take it in the back room and do the painting and the addition of the thin sheets in the center. Probably I would cut this apart and divide it into 2 halves and then fill the center with those folds. There's a piece right behind us here. Let me show you what I'm talking about. After this is done, this is going to dry now. What I would do is take the pieces and actually glue them together in a way on a backing sheet, and then the thin sheets would be in the center right here on end. These are not glued in yet, but these have had the edges painted with iridescent mica powders and paint, and then those would be glued in on end. So the thin sheets that were made in the vat are used as a thin, lacy contrast to the larger, more sculptural forms.
It's very interesting. Let's now go and see some finished art. This is fascinating. I'm absolutely fascinated at the Art Focus Limited to work with Martha and see what she has done here. Well, I certainly enjoyed a day of the life of an artist, very creative and very unusual, downtown in San Diego. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. Until we see you again, have a wonderful day.